Our next panel is powered by Tribe Accelerator. This is collaboration in a decentralized ecosystem, why government and corporates need it. To remain relevant and competitive, governments and corporates have always been aware of the need to innovate. Today, the thirst for innovation has never been stronger. And blockchain is one area where governments and corporates are beginning to experiment extensively. Now is your chance to hear directly from them on what they feel are the benefits of blockchain, what is needed to implement it, and how they will potentially use blockchain services in their organization. This panel is moderated by MING and features panelists Patrick Yale, Veronica Tan, Vinay Mohan, and Alan Lim. Please welcome your panel.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon for this interesting panel that we have government agencies, large corporates, and the top-tier blockchain technical partners here today. But before we begin, let me get all of them to introduce themselves. So maybe we'll start with Vinay first.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Vinay. I'm from ConsenSys in Singapore. Globally, ConsenSys is one of the largest integrated blockchain technology companies. We build developer infrastructure, public-private consortia, government advisory, and also now increasingly into investments.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Veronica from IMDA, the Infocomm Media Development Agency. We are a government agency responsible for driving the digital economy strategy for Singapore. So specifically, I'm from the technology team in IMDA looking at some of the emerging technologies that would make sense and have a high level of potential. Blockchain is one of them, and my team does a lot of the blockchain ecosystem development work.
Hi guys, my name is Patrick. I lead the PwC Venture Hub. So my Venture Hub basically deals a lot with investors and startups. And in recent years, we've been doing a lot of work in the space of blockchain. And we have done quite a few collaborations with blockchain companies.
Hi everyone, my name is Alan. I head up the IBM Blockchain Lab. So we really work with the ecosystem to design and build blockchain-based business networks.
Thank you so much. So I think a lot of times when we talk about blockchain, people often view this as a very collaborative technology. And I think today what we're seeing out there in the market is that there are more consortium-like structures being formed where different companies are hosting nodes to secure this blockchain network itself that they have set out for each of their industries. So I think something very interesting that recently happened was that ConsenSys recently launched the Singapore Blockchain Landscape Report together with the support of the IMDA, Temasek, and MAS. Maybe, Vinay, you could share with us more about what's your thoughts on the Singapore ecosystem and the landscape itself.
Yeah, sure. So I think the first thing to sort of mention is why the word ecosystem is so important. And I don't need to say this to this audience here because I'm sure you all really know very well. Blockchain is a network technology. It is not for the benefit of just one individual. It's an inclusionist technology by its nature. It's peer-to-peer. It takes out the intermediary. It's for all of us, right? So there's this natural element of people coming together. That's what makes blockchain successful. And coming to Singapore, I think the fascinating thing that we found when we were researching the report and working with IMDA and MAS and Temasek was Singapore has the natural conditions to welcome any ecosystem, not just blockchain. So for the last 35, 40 years, Singapore has been very successful in trade finance, native high-end technology, work that companies like IBM do, because it has a welcoming climate where public sector, private sector, developer communities, and academia work hand in hand. So I think that is the most important differentiating factor. And while we find that every single country globally has some sort of an ecosystem, what's important is, in Singapore's case, Singapore has the balance. It has the parties talking to each other. It has growth at a nice, even pace. And it does not do blockchain for the sake of doing blockchain. There is sustainable adoption here, which I think is happening. And that's important.
That's interesting. So I think one other lady that has gone across the world leading the charge at IMDA and looking at how other markets are dealing with blockchain and building up the ecosystem. Maybe Veronica, what are some of your learnings as you travel across the world over the last few years that your team has taken back to help shape Singapore's tech landscape on blockchain itself?
So I think one interesting learning we've had is when we visited Zoop, which is also known as Crypto Valley. It's actually quite well known for having a very strong base of startups and blockchain companies all landing there. So we went over last year to pay a visit, spoke to people that were involved in Crypto Valley Association, spoke to the VCs there, and I think the VCs there were very instrumental in bringing together that ecosystem. And of course, one natural question we asked them is, but why is there a need to have a specific place for blockchain players to come together? Simply because this is a very digital world and perhaps it didn't really need a physical place. What they shared is, yes, although you may not have needed a physical place to bring people together right down in the same locality, but having people housed together, you foster a certain growth, a certain collaboration and knowledge exchange and sharing. So what they have in Crypto Valley is, I think, very frequent networking sessions or just casual exchanges where people are able to share and learn, exchange information, particularly in the early and nascent stage where there's a lot of people where they don't know too much about a certain thing and they can share and learn from each other. So I think Zoop was actually a very interesting use case for us to study, and we brought some of these ideas back to Singapore to also look into growing the ecosystem in Singapore. Earlier on, Yi-Ming talked about how blockchain is a collaborative technology. It is not something that an individual company usually takes on its own, unlike other technology areas like IoT or artificial intelligence, where they could use a certain technology, maybe grow a certain team internally and just deploy it. For blockchain, I think the value proposition comes when you have network effects, when you transact across organizational boundaries. So even more so is it more critical for growing blockchain adoption that you do have industries coming together, industry ecosystems and consortiums forming, so that some of these knowledge can be shared and the trust built so that you can develop into the next steps of blockchain adoption.
Interesting. And I think for Patrick himself, you must have seen your team creating the PwC 2018 Global Blockchain Survey. And I think three main problems that hinder this technology's adoption is, of course, the lack of trust, regulatory uncertainty, as well as the inability to bring networks together, which is something that hinders collaboration as a whole. So as we move forward 1.5 to 2 years since the survey itself, what are your thoughts on how things have changed over the last 2 years, and what are corporates seeing in your role at PwC Hub?
Yeah. I think we've been talking to a lot of corporates over the last couple of years, right? So in the initial years, clearly people are just looking and seeing, right? Not real action in the sense that carrying out the POCs. But increasingly we saw and as we spoke, right, to the various COOs as well as the investment team, they are more open to using blockchain, right, to connect with their suppliers, to connect with other parts of the ecosystem. And very importantly, there are a lot more POCs, so they are not just looking anymore, right? They are actually dabbling, right, exploring and going into the real test case, the real use cases to try to make it work. Of course, at this juncture, all right, the results and the fruits of that labor is still not clear yet, right? But suffice to say, if you look at the whole ecosystem as a whole, I would say, based on the survey, more than 80% of the companies are actually dabbling in the blockchain itself. So I think that's a very good development. Yeah.
Okay. And for someone that has been working with a lot of corporates through your different initiatives like Trade Trust, Trade Lens and Food Trust at IBM, as well as double hatting as the role of the SG Tech chairman of the blockchain club. So I think maybe you could share with us more of like, what are you seeing as well? And what are some activities that are upcoming that you are excited about for this ecosystem?
Right, so first and foremost, I'd like to echo some of the views that have been shared by the rest of the panel over here. I think ecosystem is very important. The different parts of the ecosystems, whether it's corporate, startups, regulators, I think those are very important ingredients. That's certainly what we see. We see experimentations across different industries, taking a very, I would say, critical view to, and not assuming it's blockchain for everything, I think is very important. The way I kind of look at it, to simplify things, I look at it, if I could use 3 acronyms, B, L, and T, right? BLT, right? So I think it's very important, and T is at the back. T for technology is at the back. I think it's very important to just look at fundamentally what's the business problem we're trying to solve. I think that has to be very important. But also looking at the incentive mechanisms. As we look at different parts of a blockchain network, I think it's very important to figure out what is in it for every party in the network. And that drives how the network is designed, who pays for it, what's the incentive mechanism to kind of look at it. I think some of this is inbuilt for perhaps the public and permissionless space, but I think from the private permission space, I think that's something that has to be consciously looked into, and that's something that we see increasingly as well. On the L side, which is the legal part of it, I think that needs to be looked into. I think it's still evolving. What is legal tender? What's the implications from a legal perspective? What are the frameworks that work with the different jurisdictions that we look at? I think those are things that we look at. And from a technology perspective, I think we see a maturing of different technologies from where we were, even just 3 years ago, right? When we started, some of the things that is evolved from the various protocols. In the past, we would have spoken about Hyperledger versus Ethereum, but perhaps now it's less of an issue. For example, the enterprise Ethereum has joined Hyperledger as a project. Same thing, ConsenSys has just joined, Hyperledger, right? We have Joe Lubin sitting on the board, for example. So I think we see, increasingly collaboration across different parts of the ecosystem. So I think that's only encouraging because I think together we're stronger and we are able to handle more use cases together. So I'm very encouraged by that.
Awesome. And I think you mentioned something, the statement in your whatever you just mentioned, which is together we are stronger.
Yeah.
And one such initiative that we see in Singapore is, of course, Project Ubin.
Yeah.
And over the years, ConsenSys has been working closely with the MAS on Project Ubin as well as different global public and private initiative. Maybe you could share with us more, like Vinay yourself, why is this relationship extremely important for the growth of this ecosystem?
So 2 things. First is, Ubin is the shining example of how Singapore conducts itself. When we talk about Singapore being a true blue ecosystem, that is very visible in the way the Ubin world has evolved. So if I can go back to the days when Alan and I were part of Ubin Phase 2, the MAS ran all 3 protocols in parallel because they did not want to be biased towards any one. The ecosystem would decide which is the best. You had research scholars sitting in on our discussions, you had students sitting in, you had startups, you had the banks. So it's truly the coming together of all these different parties. And let's not forget, these are all parties with different interests in mind, right? And the comfort that Singapore can bring to adversarial stakeholders who can all come to one place is just amazing. Because you need this healthy tension, you need people to be able to disagree with each other in a safe space. Because that leads to better outcomes altogether. So I think Ubin firstly is important because it contributes to Singapore's image as a positive ecosystem and as a force multiplier in the world of blockchain. But more importantly, when you undertake something which is as foundational as changing the way money is managed, right, and public money. Now we can build all the payment systems in the world that we want to, but if the settlement leg does not work well, the buck has just stopped. And that's why it's so important that we see initiatives like Ubin happening at a central bank level where, philosophically, I think it's a huge step forward. The MAS basically said, look, what happens if we go down? What happens if the MAS becomes a single point of failure? How can the network still run? So it's a very important national investment to keep the fiat system and fractional reserve banking as we know it alive. But I think it's also creating the plumbing for the mainstream conversation, and hopefully by next year we should see something happening very seriously in the world of central bank issued digital currencies, and all that will not be possible unless we take these baby steps with Ubin, and that's why Ubin is important.
I think you clearly pointed out that Ubin is a centerpiece of what we are doing here in Singapore with the MAS itself, and I'm sure this form of collaboration is not only just for the financial ecosystem, of course for things like supply chain, for food. And I think now going back to Alan again, your team has launched large-scale projects like trade lands, food trusts, and there are more than 100 organizations involved in this sort of collaborative ecosystem. How do you guys work out this form of governance when there's so many people going on trying to have their say in this ecosystem?
Right. So I think for any business network, I think governance is very important, and I will separate this from just on the architecture side, which is where you may have different nodes providing validation and all that. Governance, in my view, right, encompasses how decisions are made collectively. For example, decision on who joins a particular network, what's the rule, for example, for someone leaving the network, what's the legal course of action, for example. So these are some of the things that goes beyond the technology. For some of the specific examples that you kind of mentioned, we've convened, for example, an advisory council for something like IBM Food Trust. And it's important, because we hear specifically from the industry themselves what's needed to succeed. So, for example, one of the things that came up very strongly was, the adoption of standards, right? What would make sense, for example, from a food perspective, like GS1 as a standard. Why that's important? Because the way we see it, it's not a single company's project or product, but it's really a facilitation of an ecosystem for people to come in. Will there be other networks? Will we connect to other networks who serve different purpose? I think the answer is yes. And the better we organize ourselves in a way, whether it's through an advisory council, a formal legal entity, for example, to make those decisions, have a steering committee, for example. I think those are different legal structures that could be put in place, some more formal than others. I think certain industries lend itself more clearly to more formal structures where a small group of people, for example, could make decisions on an elected basis. So I think that's something that I think is evolving. We've seen some early examples where there's an advisory council that's set up. Some of our networks, for example, We.Trade started off as a bunch of banks, but it really came together as a separate legal entity with that small structure and organized. So I think that will evolve. Again, it will just depend on the use cases, and hopefully, regardless of any other governance structure, the main thing is not to keep, to be very open, that blockchain is a team sport, and really build for scalability and to be part of a wider network. Yep.
You mentioned a bit about advisory council and structures, and I think this is something that probably Patrick will see quite a bit as a consultant working with the large corporates, startups, and government agencies. Maybe you could share with us some insights on your thoughts on how various stakeholders can work together better through any advice that you would want to share.
So a lot of time, you want blockchain to be successful, it has to be an industry-led initiative or effort. And very importantly, the rules of engagement must be set up front. All right, meaning to say that different stakeholders, right? How do you engage each other? Because we know that the information, the data that you put on the blockchain, right? To make it useful, it has to be interactive. It has to be time sensitive. That's why blockchain is very useful, right? And there's a security element as well. So I think back to Alan's point, for blockchain adoption, all right, within for example, a permissioned blockchain area, you really need to have clear rules of engagement. You need to have a robust governance structure with a strong controls framework, so that you can do check and balances. And some of these check and balances might not be done online on the chain. You might need to adopt traditional methods of agreements off the chain as well. So suffice to say that blockchain is not just online. All right, it has to be adopted from a business commercial standpoint that is legally sound, right? And you have the right agreements off the chain and on the chain as well. Then it makes a proper, complete framework. Yeah.
Okay. And I think you mentioned a bit about industry-led innovation, and a lot of stuff are industry-led itself. So I think from Veronica's point of view, having launched 2 blockchain challenge successfully today, and you are launching the 3rd one, maybe share with us what are some of your team's thoughts when you conceive like each blockchain challenge, the idea for it and the question and the challenge set for it?
So I think we started the blockchain challenge about 2 years ago, and we evolve it over time as the blockchain ecosystem matures and the needs evolve over time. So when we first started, that was about 2 years ago, and there was actually a lot of talk about the need to experiment and get hands-on with blockchain. There was a lot of talk and I think slightly less hands-on. Some of the things that we realized is sometimes companies are a bit more traditional. They need a bit more concrete ROI before they can even be allowed to enter into a POC. So what we did is to try to lower the barriers for companies to get on board the POCs by offering funding support so that if they have an interesting, viable idea with a minimum viable ecosystem to come together to transact, then we would be able to support them in the POC phase. So that was how we started, and the initial theme we picked was to focus on the non-financial applications of blockchain. If we take us back to a few years ago, I think a lot of the discussions was around Bitcoin, blockchain in the trade finance and in the financial sector. What we wanted to do is to then encourage blockchain applications outside of the financial sector. And I think right now, 2 years later, we have seen a good proliferation of projects beyond the financial sector. So if you look at the ecosystem report that was launched recently by ConsenSys, yes, finance is definitely still leading in blockchain deployments, but there are interesting projects in art, in healthcare, in energy, and so on. Over time, I think the other thing that we realized that was needed is actually the importance of ecosystems. And PwC's report also talked about the need to form industry ecosystems in order for companies to come together, gain a certain level of trust, and to be able to move things forward. So it came out with the idea of the need for a blockchain engagement platform and ended up working with Tribe Accelerator and MING in the form of open nodes. So we have just launched our next blockchain challenge. I think it's also to celebrate and also to catalyze the further growth of Singapore's blockchain ecosystem. We do see many POCs with minimum viable ecosystems, and for them to be able to move forward, they need to be able to scale and onboard more members onto the value chain. So one of the themes is really about growing existing blockchain business networks. The next one is, I think, a bit related to what Alan talked about, how Ethereum and Hyperledger are coming together, sitting in each other's bots and so on. So we actually, end of the day, it's not literally one ledger, one chain that's going to be the solution to everything. There will be different needs. Some are public, some are not public. There will be different types of blockchains to serve different use cases. And in the end, it will end up looking like a mesh of chains or a network of networks. And therefore, the other theme that we have is about interconnecting different blockchain networks together. So I think as we evolve the blockchain challenge over time, we will look at the state of what is needed in the industry at that point in time and try to hatch a certain theme around it so that it can be relevant to the industry partners and basically give a certain incentive through funding support and finding the right partners for them so that they can take their projects forward and overall help Singapore's blockchain ecosystem to move towards maturity.
I think one thing that was mentioned for the blockchain challenge 3, or the third blockchain challenge that you guys just launched would probably be interoperability or of chains coming together as one. Maybe Alan, you could share what's your thoughts about this space in 2020 for interoperability of chains?
Right. So I think there's a lot to unpack there, right? And I want to separate the idea of integration and connectivity with the concept of interoperability. Integration is just about connecting two different platforms. Could be based on blockchain, DLT, whatever. I think that's something that's been done on a B2B basis for many years. That technologies like APIs, messaging, it exists today. So it's very possible for two different networks to exchange information through APIs and other interfaces. But the concept of interoperability, and if we kind of break that down into a few things, right? It could be just being able to run a smart contract on multiple cloud infrastructure. That's one aspect. There's the aspect of writing, let's say, a Solidity smart contract and run on different DLT platforms. Then there's the idea of a single asset being transferred across two different DLT networks. As we go further and further up the stack, as we are looking to exchange different assets, and to do it in a way that not just a single or different nodes within a single network can kind of agree on the state of the ledger, but it kind of cuts across different networks. It becomes increasingly hard. So I think we need to be very surgical in terms of what we do, right? I think some of these will evolve, and let us be guided by the use case rather than be restricted to say, let's wait till interoperability in its truest sense to occur, and then we wait to do anything. So I think let's let the use case evolve and kind of gravitate towards that. I think that's where things are going. There are various initiatives, like for example, around the token taxonomy initiatives that's really made up of different companies. And it's really looking at the definition of what a token is and how that could be exchanged. So I think there's a lot of initiatives there. There's initiatives around, like I mentioned earlier on, around GS1, for example. if we can standardize around that, standardize around EDI standards, ISO messaging formats, for example, that makes it easier later on when somebody is building an app to be able to reuse and use different protocols and platforms. So I think that's kind of where things are going. So we're not quite there yet, but let's be guided by the use case.
What about you, Vinay?
I mean, I can't add much more. Alan's summed up really well. I am of the view that we have not discovered yet the DNA for native interoperability. It is a hard reach. I don't think we'll crack it anytime soon. At the same time, I don't think there's an urgency the way we think it should be done as of yesterday. You put it very elegantly. The use case must evolve. We must find a need for this native interoperability to happen. Otherwise, there's lots of B2B use cases where both sides feel very comfortable having off-chain infrastructure like a bridge or an API which can be neutrally governed or in the hands of an external third party. Is that decentralized? Probably not. But there are many different shades of decentralization, and we're learning how to live with a maximally decentralized world, but also a world in which we can be sufficiently decentralized and have decentralization where it matters. So I think it's something that will come over time. It is a very complex concept. It won't happen that fast.
How about Patrick? What excites you for 2020 in the space of blockchain itself?
Okay, I think I come more from a commercial sense in the way that what excites me is that the day when we can really put dollar and cents in the minds of the CEO, the CIO, the investment committee, to tell them in a report that says that you adopt this blockchain, all right, together with your suppliers and your ecosystem, this is how much money you save, this is how much money you will make. That will be very powerful. Because at the end of the day, enterprise adoption, a lot of time it boils down to dollar and cents.
And last but not least, Veronica, any thoughts on the space for the next year?
I guess blockchain is still young in the sense that it's very much today looked at from the perspective of operational efficiency. But actually, if you look at the other end of the spectrum, there are many opportunities for business model innovation. Are they really here yet? I would say maybe not. We have seen early projects from overseas. They have started, and I think they haven't really found the right commercial and operating model. So I think what excites me is, okay, literally I don't think it's going to happen in the year 2020 or next few years, but in time to come, some of these exciting new business model innovation that would change radically the way that we operate and the way we do businesses. But I think this is also very much of a longer term evolution because blockchain is a foundational technology. So I think this is a space that's very exciting, very interesting, a lot of developments. Today, perhaps most of the discussions are about operational efficiency, dollars and cents, and how much are we saving. But in the longer time, it could be how much can we be making with blockchain.
Awesome. So thank you so much once again to all of you for joining us for this panel. And yeah, we hope to see you the next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.